Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Ashoka Center for Translation, I welcome all who have joined us today as we announce our project, Women Translating Women, this Women in Translation Month. Today, we are joined by the family and friends of writer and poet Susham Bedi ji. This project would not have been possible without the generous memorial fund set up by her family, and we express our gratitude to them. My heartfelt thanks to Professor Urvashi Butalia, writer, publisher, translator, and if I may add, my mentor and teacher for accepting our invitation to give the inaugural talk. Language is at once tender and violent. As Sushamji emphasizes, following her encounters with distinct linguistic cultures, language can, on the one hand, make one feel at home, even allowing them an entry in alien territories. On the other hand, it can also push one to the peripheries, making them an outsider. Worlds get formed, deformed, and reformed between words. Caught up between them, we keep translating ourselves, sometimes for the self and sometimes for the other. Born in Delhi and studied at Delhi University, Sushamji also began working as an actor on Indian television in the late 1960s. She completed her PhD on Hindi drama from Punjab University in 1979 and migrated to New York the same year, where she continued her radio and television work as a contributor to the BBC weekly program, Letters from Abroad, and as an actor in film and television. Unlike other prominent Hindi American novelists writing in English, she wrote mainly in Hindi, predominantly about the experiences of Indians in the South Asian diaspora, focusing on psychological and cultural conflicts. Her published works include novels, short story collections, and poetry collections. Sushamji taught Hindi language and literature at the Department of Middle Eastern and Asian Languages and Cultures at Columbia University, New York. As a scholar, she wrote extensively about the challenges of teaching language acquisition to non-native speakers. Further, she served on the team of writers and programmers developing the first computerized Hindi alphabet and was instrumental in the formation of the Hindi-Urdu program at New York University. She was honored by the Uttar Pradesh Hindi Sansthan and Sahitya Academy, Delhi, among others, for her contributions to Hindi language and literature. She writes in her autobiography, Aro Avro, how the curiosity of the readers never lets the memories of writers fade away, how they continue to live through their works. Today, we remember her, her life, her work, and one of the last things she had said to a family member, remember my love. On that note, I would like to invite my colleague Neeta Gupta to take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanchit. That was really beautifully put together. I think there were some beautiful photographs which the family has also shared with us through their website. And I'd like to just, at this moment, as Sanchit mentioned, it's an honor for us that Susham Bedi's family, Purva, Rahul ji, Varun are here with us. And I would like to take a moment to request Rahul ji, her husband, to say a few words. As an introduction, Professor Rahul Bedi is the Chair of Management, Information Technology Management and International Business at the Larry L. Lewin School of Business at Berkeley College in New York. So requesting Rahul ji to please say a few words on this occasion.
Yes, Rahul ji, you're mute. Maybe you could
okay, now it's okay.
Yeah,
can you hear? Okay, yeah. Very good. Thank you, Neeta. Well, first of all, I want to extend a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you all for joining us today. Me and my family, we are very honored. We are very happy that you all could join us. It means a lot to us. And I should mention here that the genesis of the whole idea was quite some time back when Susham's first novel, Havan, was translated into English language and published by Heinemann in London, England. When the novel was published, Susham was here at Columbia. And then I'm talking of the English translation, and Susham got invited to a panel of 3 people. And panel had William Starin, Salman Rushdie, and Susham. for Susham to arrive at such at a panel of 3 people with such well-known or literary giants like Salman Rushdie and William Starren was very exciting, very great honor. But I still remember when she came back after attending the panel, she said to me, she was excited, but she was a little anguished also. She said, Rahul, there is so little knowledge among people about the literature being produced in India. The work, the body of literature and the body of essays and the poetry that has been produced in India, because people only read in English. I'm talking of the American scene or British scene. And she was invited to that panel of 3 with these guys because her first novel was just published in English, and that was translated into English and published, and that made it quite a stir. So I remember my conversation with her. I said, Susham, it's very important that your work gets translated into English language. And we kept on talking about it, but really didn't take off. Some of her work was translated into English, Japanese, Dutch, French, but sporadically. After Susham passed away, it became a dream to me. I would say raison d'etre. I said, I'm going to translate her work. We want to get her work translated into English, and so that we can reach a very wide swath of audience. And that is how we started. I talked to Varun, talked to Purva, their spouses. So we discussed what is the best way to do. So since then, I started a process. I'm talking of the last 2 years, that we started a process of identifying translators who can translate from Hindi into English, but at a very high quality standard. So I identified some, and it will be making moves slowly, have some stories, some poetry. And then finally, Varun came with the idea about his conversation with Ashoka University about starting a whole project. And we were very excited, and I'm really very happy and excited, our whole family is, that finally we have been able to put this on institutional basis, and a university of the prestigious university of the reputation that Ashoka has, that we will be collaborating together and we'll be working on this project together. And I hope to continue for quite some time working on this. And this is the idea very dear to Susham. Women writers, she was very committed to feminism. She really felt very involved with that, engaged with that, and then getting translation and conveying different writers from in Bengali, Marathi, Gujarati to English audience. So we are excited, and we are happy, and thank you for coming. And once again, we are very grateful to all of you and Ashoka University. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rahulji. That was, lovely, some lovely stories you shared with us. And thank you also to all of you for the immense faith that you've reposed in this project and this, the whole idea that we've been working on together and discussing. So this is really the moment when, on behalf of the Ashoka Center for Translation, we are delighted to announce the Women Translating Women project, which aims to bring women's stories center stage. So over the next 2 years, we will be commissioning a total of about 12 books for translation as the initial part of this project. And hopefully this will, over the years, build up into many more books. We are delighted to, of course, have the support of the Susham Bedi Memorial Fund. And we are also excited because these selected books will be translated by women translators, exploring the multiple spaces inhabited by women, in as many contexts. So, a huge excitement from all of us. And I know the kind of, responses we are getting in the social media and via email from all of you has been very heartening. I'd like to make a special mention to some of our friends and colleagues who are the backbone of this literary translation space. They are the translators who make these stories come alive for us in multiple languages. So as I say this, I'm raising a toast to our friends here, Sabah Bashir, Kripa, Gay, Ipsha, Pratishta, if she's joined us, Rita, Urvashi, Astri, Suchishmita, Urmila, all translators, all working in various languages to bring wonderful stories from across this country. So a special thank you to all of you for the work that you do. I would also, I'd like to just make a small mention of this banner that you can see up on the screen, which has been created by Amita Golapalli, has been designed for our for this project. And I think she's, I'm sure you will see more of it when you log on to the website. But we are very delighted with this beautiful, banner showcasing diversity, writing, women, sharing, stitching, magical kind of stories. So, a huge round of applause to the designer for putting this together. And moving on with the program, I'd like to invite author and publisher Urvashi Butalia to make her inaugural address to us. Urvashi is a writer, translator, and a publisher. She's the co-founder of the iconic feminist publishing house, Kali for Women, and is the director of Zuban Books. Urvashi is known for her work in the women's movement in India. In fact, she's highly respected for, whatever, and also for her writing, her award-winning oral history of partition, The Other Side of Silence, which still inspires. I mean, even now you see women getting inspired by that book and searching for these, women from the subcontinent, searching for stories which are still unwritten, unspoken, untold. So this is a huge, it's something that we owe Urvashi for laying that, foundation for thinking and writing on these subjects. So I cannot think of a person more suited to speak to us about women's writing and the importance of translating women's narratives. So over to you, Urvashi, and let's not keep anything now, I'll step back. I'm just going to make a small mention here that, we will be taking some questions at the end of it. So if you feel you want to just post your questions to the chat box.
Thanks, Sanchit. Hello, everyone. Good evening. And Nita, whenever you come back, good evening. Sanchit will tell you that I said it while you disappeared. So let me start by congratulating Ashoka and the Susham Bedi Memorial Fund on this initiative, Women Translating Women. What better way to honor the memory of one of our best known writers, Susham Bedi, who passed away a couple of years back, and whose life was dedicated to the things that she loved, writing and teaching, and a bit of acting. Rahulji, many years ago, when I was still a young publisher, and that was many years ago, I remember meeting her along with other Hindi women writers and thinking how much I would like to bring the works of so many of these India's amazing women writers into different languages. And it's a dream that has only been partially realized. But through this initiative of Ashoka's Women Translating Women, I hope to see many more books translated into Indian languages. Although Susham Bedi's works have been translated, as Rahulji mentioned, into some languages, I think there is still much more that needs to be done. And when we're talking of translation, we need to look really not only at our literatures traveling out of the country, but our literatures traveling within the country as well. And much of Susham Bedi's work that focuses on identity and on culture and belonging, on finding one's space, so much of this is relevant in India, and it really deserves to be translated. So given this, I think the context of setting up the Ashoka Center for Translation and its project of Women Translating Women is a really major initiative and a necessary one. There's so much we need to do for translation that a center such as this, especially being located inside a university, I think, will ensure that translation, which still remains something of an individual and isolated activity in many ways, will get the attention that it deserves through being taught, through being discussed, through being shared, through being responded to, and so on. And I think it's very significant that this one of the center's first projects is really this one. The translation of women's works by women is a crucial area, needs attention. There's some obvious reasons for this, and even though all of us know them well, let me just point to some of these to remind ourselves. It's no secret that for the longest time, the world of literature and writing has been male-dominated. It's men who get published, and really until the 70s, it was rare to see women's writing in the mainstream world. It's from the 70s on that not only in India, but across the world, we see the rise of feminist and independent publishers who turn their attention to women. It's not accidental that this is because of the growth of a vibrant and dynamic women's movement or women's movements across the world, which begin to question everything, including the absences in the world of literature and the invisibility of women in them. It's also these movements that open up in academia ways of studying women. They bring to attention different tools that are needed to study women's lives. And in their hunger for women's writings, these movements create, this is very crucial, I think, a kind of hospitable environment in which such writing can be received, read, responded to. They take nothing for granted, the activists of that time. And one of the things that women's movements across the world point to is how, for centuries, men have been seen as the sole arbiters of taste, of what is called aesthetics. It's men who have dictated what a masterpiece is, what a classic is, and what kind of literature can be dismissed. And this, of course, has then influenced the world of publishing, where too, by and large, publishers have been men, though especially the ones in position of selecting what gets published and what doesn't, and of course, what gets translated and what doesn't. It is also men's stories that were told in the writing that existed, men's books that were reviewed. It was men who won awards and got recognition. We don't need figures, and I'll give you just one figure to illustrate this, that in the 115 years of its history, the Nobel Literary Prize has only gone to 14 women. So even if they tried to make up for it now, it would take them a good half century before the numbers could even remotely begin to even out. So a corollary of this is that because the world of writing and publishing was and remains so dominated by men, although it has begun to change, what they write, what men write, comes to be seen as somehow the norm. I use the word within quotes. Something that is, again, I use within quotes, neutral, something that is objective, something that is about the world and not specific. Women's writing is always the other, and somehow the expectation seems to be, unfortunately, that it can only then be about women. That men's writing is somehow about the world and women's writing is about women, which assumption immediately places women in a separate compartment as if they did not belong to the world, or the world that they describe is a separate world from the real world. So imagine this context, which has begun to change, but it still remains the overwhelming context. In this, it becomes really difficult for translators, even more so for women translators, to find acceptability in the world of books for women's writing, because women are not among the prize winners of medals and literary awards by and large. It becomes even more difficult for translators to convince publishers to take on women authors. The whole system is biased against this. As one translator put it, she said, there is a deep sexism in the world of literature. And when that is combined with a racism, regardless of whether it is between countries or within countries, between languages or within languages, then women lose out. And this is really difficult to talk about because you can't really, as a translator, go to a publisher and say, hey, you're not looking at the work I'm offering you because you're a sexist. He's going to throw you out of the door. So it is actually the elephant in the room, this thing which governs so much of what gets selected to be published and written and translated. Of course, publishers, that is my breed, we are not the only ones to be blamed because all of us know, publishers know, writers know, readers know, translators know how translation widens not only our horizons as readers, but also those of the writers as they learn about other cultures, other stories. And yet all of us know this, but it's one of the most difficult things to beat the hierarchy about this. And although I'm speaking only about women, I think it's fair to say how this kind of discrimination, if one can call it that, can be generalized to other communities that inhabit the margins of our society. Again, there's one other thing that influences this. I think in the world of writing, the writing of an original work is often seen as something of a superior act, and translation is somehow seen as secondary or, within quotes, inferior. And yet, translations are what help works to travel across the world into different languages and cultures. And without them, our knowledge of literatures would be much poorer. But translation is also, interestingly, a matter of another person entering the head of the writer and representing that work to the world. And it is something that can change historically, unlike a piece of writing which once written is written unless the author goes back to rewrite it, which is rare. But you can have one translator translate a work at a particular time and another translator translate the same work at a different historical moment and come at it from a different perspective. And I want to give you one example of this, which sheds light on this question of women translating women and the motivation of women sometimes or often to translate women. The example I want to give is of a well-known classic in the world of women's writing, which is Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. This book was published in French, and its English translation came out in 1953 or the early 50s. And that translation has lived in the world of English for over 50 years. It's a translation that was done by a man called Pashley, I think his name was. And when he translated the book, not only did he simplify considerably the Beauvoir's very complex and complicated use of language, but he also excised huge portions of the book. Now, of course, a translator takes such liberties, but it was not until 50 or 60 years after, it was not until 12 years ago, that two women, Constance Borde and Sheila Malovany Chevalier, decided to translate the complete text. Now, when they worked afresh on the text, they did so for various reasons. Of course, one of these was curiosity, because they'd read the original and the translation and noticed that there was a great deal missing, and they asked the question, why? In the years between the publication of the first translation and their questions, a great deal had happened, including the growth of the women's movement and questions about women's histories. The translators living in France knew well the history of Simone de Beauvoir as a philosopher, and they found this aspect completely missing in the translation. So when they revisited the text in detail, there were two key things that stood out. One, that the original translator had, as I said, simplified the author's language a great deal. And two, that he had taken out huge passages. Many of them were to do with the author's philosophical thoughts. What could have been the reason for this? The possible and very likely reason, I think, is that the translator, a man, thought that most readers of Simone de Beauvoir's book would likely be women, and they perhaps would not understand complicated philosophical concepts, because philosophical thinking, histories of ideas have been dominated also by men. And perhaps the translator felt, as many men did at the time, sorry, when did I get muted?
Just a second ago, Professor, there was a glitch. There
was a glitch and then it suddenly got muted. Okay, so I was saying that what could have been the reason for the translator having taken out those huge passages? And clearly what it was very likely was that he felt that philosophy and women's intelligence, or the size of women's brains, did not have a lot in common. So to make the book comprehensible for them, he took out what he thought would be the more complicated books. Whatever his motivation, if we want to be charitable, we can say perhaps he didn't have time, and perhaps he felt that these things were excessive and the book would hold better together. Whatever his motivations, half a century later for the translators, both women doing this translation It was an exercise in giving the writer her due and bringing justice to her writing. It was what I call an act of solidarity. Justice and solidarity are not usually the terms one connects with the world of writing and publishing, and yet I think it's no accident that the increase in translations of the works of women comes as a result of women's movements worldwide, where one of the key questions has been the absence of women's voices from the world of literature and knowledge. And this absence has been addressed in different ways by women, through the instituting of awards, through setting up feminist publishing houses, and through translation. I want to move briefly to another question that I thought may be interesting for us to look at and which connects with this thought. And that question is, what do women look for in the works they choose to translate? Why do they translate the works they do translate? This is a question that has always fascinated me, and I decided that I would search the net for some answers. And I was surprised to find some very interesting answers. I didn't see anyone saying, oh, I look for a good story, I look for a good plot, I look for how characters built, etc. But here's what they said. One translator said she chose a particular author's work because she fell in love with it. And she took the trouble to translate an excerpt and send it to publishers who were not that keen because the writer was a woman and a foreign woman. So two discriminations were at work there. The fact that she was a woman and the second that she was a foreign woman. Another translator said she was drawn to a writer she chose to work with because the writer spoke candidly about sexual abuse and about the blurring of lines between consent and rape. A third translator said she was drawn to a particular author because the author did not use gender markers for her main characters, and she wanted to see how the author could do that. And then yet another one said she loved the work she was translating because it was a story of two mothers, of a mother and two daughters, and in the telling of the story, embroideries on cloth became a wonderful metaphor for the story itself and for the relationship between the three main characters. And a last one said she loved the book she chose to translate because each of the characters described a woman the author had loved. It was a memoir, the book, or who had loved her. And the book was a life told through love. I was struck by each of these statements because to me, they represented something very deeply personal for each of these translators. And as I read through them, I wanted to go back to the example of Simone de Beauvoir and the translation of The Second Sex, because I thought for them too, the translation was not a literary enterprise. It was very much the setting right of a historical injustice, the exercise of unsilencing the voice of a woman they felt had been unfairly silenced. And this, I think, has been the motivation for bringing women's voices into the mainstream for many translators. I'm not saying for all, but for many. But in doing this, then translators fight on multiple fronts. First, they seek legitimacy for the writers they want to translate, who may not be well-known, who may not be award winners, who may not be men. Often these are first-time writers or unknown writers or writers who do not conform to the norms of greatness and importance that have been set. And then the ways in which their writers write are not necessarily the ways in which established canons are seen to be made. And so they are not only arguing for bringing a woman into the world of translation, they are arguing for bringing a woman for all the reasons that literary heavyweights don't recognize. And they are arguing for a difference to be recognized as a positive thing. And in the publishing world, which is by and large a conservative world, this is a very, very difficult enterprise. I want to end by telling you three little stories also about translation and which relate to the point I've been trying to make about the ways in which women choose to translate. And I'm not generalizing for all women, but I think that this is something that allows us to enter the world of women's writing and women translating women in very different ways, using very different pathways from the traditional world of translating and writing, which has been male dominated. And my stories are as follows. I have been reading a book which somebody gave me. It is a book in Hindi on Shaheen Bagh, the big Anti-Citizens Amendment Act demonstration that took place across India. And the book called Shaheen Bagh takes as its metaphor the women's protests across the country and calls them all Shaheen Baghs. The book is in Hindi, and as I have been reading it as a reader with a mounting excitement, I am thinking of how much I want to translate this book. And I'm thinking of the need to translate this book because the insights it gives into women's lives and the ways in which women get politicized and the ways in which they think of the nation are amazing insights. And I'm already in love with the text, which I want to translate. And it helps that the author is somebody whose writing I really admire. Yesterday, I was in Tamil Nadu speaking, so this is my second story, speaking at a large, huge conference of the Tamil Nadu Progressive Writers Association. And a day before the talk was to happen, I received a mail from a woman writer who was attending the thing saying, "Can you send me the text of your speech?" And I said to her, "But I haven't written it." So she said, "Could you just put down the points and send them to me?" So I sat down and wrote it and I sent it to her. And overnight, she had translated the entire 30-minute talk into Tamil so that the audience, largely Tamil speaking, would not miss out on what I was saying. And my third story is a story about the excitement of women translating women, which breaks many bounds. And this is the story of a memoir of the women's movement in Maharashtra, written collectively by women. So it's not a personal memoir. It already breaks the mold of the memoir. It's a memoir of a movement. And the author sent it to me and said that she is getting a group of women, each of whom has volunteered to translate one part of the memoir, because after all, if it's a collective book, it should be collectively translated. Each of these acts of translation, or the wish to translate on my part, are really acts of love, which come from a strong belief in the importance of women's voices and our commitment as women to getting those voices out there. And I'm really delighted that Ashoka has taken this initiative to set up the Women Translating Women initiative, and that the Susham Bedi Memorial Foundation is helping to support this, because you are together doing something for which the moment could not be more apt. There is a hunger for listening and reading and understanding women's voices. And there are women ready to translate those voices. So the only thing that's left now is to get that done and put them out into the world. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Urvashi. I'm sorry, my network is just so, jumpy today, just going on, coming and going, but it was lovely to listen to you. And especially because you've had a really tough day with no electricity and no internet. So this is really like everything came together just at the nick of the moment to, bring us all together and to make this announcement that much richer with this with this talk. And really you've set a kind of a tone, and it's the perfect note to begin this whole project with.
Thank you so much. It's quite overwhelming, actually. From the time the Bedis made this generous fund available to us to this moment, there have been so many developments, not only the kind of interest this has generated on social media, emails, messages that we are getting from people. There are writers who have written in English who are requesting if their works could be translated into other Indian languages. There are writers writing in Tamil and Malayalam who are writing to us saying that, would you like to look at this manuscript and can you find us a translator, and so on. When we actually kind of began this project, when Varun, for instance, for the first time approached us, even we had not envisaged that this is the kind of enormity, this is the kind of interest, this project is going to generate. And my own engagement has only gotten deeper and deeper as the months went on. And I will maybe talk about it a little bit later. I think first we must give chance, Sanjit, to other people who might have questions. And if you need me to speak, I'll come back again. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. So I'll just quickly look at the questions. There's a question from Nazia. They ask, thank you. They say, thank you for such a thought-provoking and insightful address. And the question is, do you have any advice for women translators who are formally untrained and have just started and are learning on the go? They were trained in translating from Russian into English, but find themselves drawn to and translating from Urdu into English. Professor Butalia?
Nazia, actually, I think one of the things that the Ashoka Center, I hope, will do, apart from actually doing translations, is to do some training workshops for translators who wish to be trained, because it is important to have that kind of training. Of course, you can learn on the go, and it's important to do that. But I think training is needed. And also what I think is really necessary is to do the research that translation requires, to go beyond the text, to try and read and understand the context of the text so that you get what is being said in the text within the context in which it was written. Because very often we just focus on the text on the page itself and don't go beyond that. I think it's very important to go beyond that as a beginning. So I hope that that'll be, that's something you'll do.
Thank you, Professor. Ashlesha they've raised their hand. You can go ahead. Please unmute yourself first.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so I just wanted to ask what is the process for application for this project? And when does it start, and are there any requirements for it?
Any project-related questions will be actually answering towards the end because a couple of such questions are coming in. So we'll share a bit of such logistical information about the project towards the end. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Anukul? Yeah.
Hi, Professor. It's lovely to hear you again. Professor, I have seen in a lot of spaces when it is a woman telling a woman's story, vis-a-vis a man telling a woman's story, the way the story, the treatment to the story is very different. It's more of the delicate, the story when treated by a woman, there is more sensitivity shown with the character. There is more a sense of responsibility shown that a woman's character is portrayed in a very similar fashion as it is in the literature when adapted into a movie or in the original language when translated. So do you think women bring a sense of empathy when they translate a woman's story, or vis-a-vis when a man does, because the lens of a woman is more, so to say, relatable with the character? Or is it that in general, when women tell women's story, there is a sense of sensitivity, but I don't want to generalize it that women are more sensitive or something like that, but it is often seen that when women tell women's stories, the treatment is way better and way softer and tender with the character as compared to a man telling a woman's story.
Yeah, Anukul, hi. I'm not sure that, I think at some level what you're saying is right, that it may be easier for a woman to relate to telling a woman's story because it's a world she can enter more easily. But remember that that is a world that's also separated by all kinds of other hierarchies, which don't necessarily allow you to that easily take gender as the common linking factor, because it could be, if an upper caste woman is writing or translating a Dalit woman's story, there is a barrier there that does not allow her to enter that world that easily. So I think we have to be careful of these generalizations. They are not incorrect, but they are not hard and fast. And I think the world of translation is something that we, at least in India, are still learning about. So I think one can, and that is why I was very careful not to essentialize, but I was giving you examples of interesting motivations that women have given for translating women, and how difficult it makes it for them in the given literary world to take that further into the public eye, because the literary world is so hemmed in by its constraints, which are created for all kinds of historical reasons. So I think we need to just keep all of those things in mind as things that govern our choices, but I don't think we can generalize. Does that answer your question at all?
Sure, Professor. Precisely why I asked, because I didn't wish to generalize, but it's a constant underlying treatment that I have seen with these stories.
Yeah.
So that's right. Thank you so much. That answers.
So I'll be reading out more questions from the chat first. Yuvanika wants to know which Indian languages would you say are most in need of visibility at the current moment in terms of translation to both English and other Indian languages?
Well, I think, of course, all of them, but you're quite right in asking that question, because there is a hierarchy in our languages. And that hierarchy relates to many things, including how large the spoken, how should I say, hinterland of those languages is. So there's a lot of Hindi, there's a lot of Marathi, Bengali, Tamil, Malayalam, all of that. And I would say, I mean, in our translation work, for example, we have found it very difficult to get stories out of Konkani, let's say. Found it quite difficult to get stories out of Oriya, although it's not that Oriya does not have a very rich tradition. So I would not say that, I mean, I think there are languages which are more powerful where works are translated more easily. There are others where they're not. But I wouldn't use the word in need of. That's why I'm kind of hesitating. I think that all languages are in need of getting translated. Some make it more successfully into the world of translation than others because of the many power hierarchies that we have been talking about. If by saying in need of, you mean which ones should we have programs to finance translations for, then yes, I think we should be providing finance, but that's not something that happens in India. You know, one of the things that is a real barrier to the wealth of our literature getting translated across our own languages and internationally is the fact that we have no translation grants. Many other countries have translation grants for all they feel it a matter of pride to get their literature out into the world. We just sit on it and pretend it doesn't exist.
Thank you, Professor. Afrin asks, they say they're curious about how challenges to translating women's writing have changed or evolved since the time of Kali for women.
I think they have evolved. They have to, you know, that's 40 years ago. At the time, women in India, women's works were hardly getting translated, especially into English. I can speak about that because in Kali, we were translating into English. So first of all, women's works were hardly getting published, and translation was seen as a secondary thing. So they were hardly getting translated. I think now what has changed is that women are getting published more by a range of publishers, whether in English or in the Indian languages, and their works are getting translated more as well. But we are still really looking at the better known writers in the better known languages. Some of the lesser known writers, the more experimental writers, the writers who come from marginalized communities, their works hardly make it into translation. And that requires a lot of effort on the part of publishers also to seek out those works.
Thank you, Professor. Meenaji, right here, do you have any advice for a woman translator focused on the literary value of source works? For example, Narsi Mehta and Gujarati ghazals yet mostly by men, and still finds not much support for in-depth translation into English?
You know, Rita, I think this is a question you should take.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll address Meena Ben. There is a lot of devotional literature in English that is coming out. I mean, we do know that Meera and Narsi Mehta and Underl and many other things are being translated. But I think every now and then we encounter the commercial imperatives of the publishing industry, and publishers also do need to survive. So sometimes there's a whole bunch of context. It's not so much the marginalization of certain figures, but it is also the fact that the numbers of works published in translation are still very low, right? We are not talking of high volumes at all. So in that sense, the challenges that lie for translated literature in general are still very enormous. Gitanjali Shri and the award and all of that notwithstanding. So I think it's a much larger question that you are raising. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Go on, Meenaj.
Thank you for answering, Rita, and the whole Ms. Urvashi and all of you have been wonderful. I just feel very passionately about this particular area. I've been working in it for the last 15 years. And yes, I know there is an immediate need for translation of issues that are current, but somebody like Narsi Mehta, who is beyond sect and who is beyond gender, when we have these characteristics, it seems to me very sad that we bring in a factor of a gender perspective in order to elevate some writing. And we are neglecting something so important, that the Oxford Anthology of Bhakti Poetry did not include Narsi Mehta. And I spoke to the editor, and he said, "Who is that?"
Yeah,
I have
Meena
not
Ben,
gotten over that shock, and I had to raise this question. I know it's not precisely in your context.
No, I'm glad
this
you
needs
did.
to be done. This needs to have something done about.
I'm glad you did, Meena Ben. I think we'll send you our email ID. We also have a project on translating Bhakti. And so maybe we can take up your question in that context and have a conversation with you. So thank you so much, Meena Ben.
So I
Sanchit,
think
you can go ahead.
just quick response also to Meena Ben, Rita, is that the absences, I think, are very, very telling, that of the ways in which the selection of who to include and who not to include operates. And that's the point that I was also trying to raise, that in some ways those selections are hidebound by a certain kind of history, and publishers are reluctant to move out of that. So thank you for raising it.
Thank you, professors. I'll now be moving to the raised hands first. So we have Shamini, and then we have Professor Pritchett.
Hi, good evening, thanks. So I actually had a slightly more solidarity and method specific question. Perhaps also maybe speaking from your own experience, that when we reach out to certain works for translation, when we are women translating other women, there is the question of language or what is being told. But what about what is being not told, right? So there are also contextual silences. And I thought maybe you could speak a bit about what those gaps are, because they can be generative also. So that's what I was curious about.
I mean, explain a bit more to me exactly what you mean.
I mean, metaphors and contexts and experiences that aren't always made visible in the work through the language or are contextually bound, that are bound by caste, geography, dialect, and when you are entering from a space of love, you're also trying to understand that difference. So what do you think the role a translator can have, a woman translator can have in that conversation?
I think it's actually, it's a really interesting and difficult question. I would expect no less from you. And it's not a question that is answered in a short space of time, but thank you for raising it. I think this isn't, it's not something that is just a relationship between a translator and a writer, or the writer's work and the translator. It is also something that then involves, say, for example, the publisher. I believe quite strongly it involves the publisher and the publisher's editor, because what is left out, or what is unsaid, or what is hard to say, but what is deeply and strongly a part of the work and informs the ways in which that work is written. And then what role the translator plays in teasing that out, and what role the publisher plays in, I suppose, foregrounding that, or, not, the word I can think of is Englishing it. You know what I mean? That when you sort of impose the standards of what is good writing, and all publishers do that, in a sense, you might lose out all of that. And it's a very, very difficult decision to take. Because if it is love, if it is an act of solidarity, then somewhere you need to respect all of that. But somewhere also you are bound by taking this world into the public domain, and taking this work into the public domain. And how do you make that difficult choice? I haven't yet found a way, but it's something that that troubles me every time we look at a work of translation, especially by women on the margins. And I could give you many examples, but it would take too much time. But it is a dilemma, and I don't have an answer to that, really.
Thank you, Professor. Before we go to Professor Pritchett, I actually did want to mention this other question by Rahulji, because it's a similar question. They were asking, what do you think of the role of reviewers and editors to judge the quality of a translation?
Yeah, I think it's essential. I think it's important if we can get sympathetic reviewers and editors who can look at a translation and come back to comment on it. But I would emphasize the word sympathetic. It has to be a reviewer who understands the context. It has to be a reviewer who's not looking at a translation merely from the point of view of how fluently it reads in the language in which it is translated, but is looking at what that work is trying to do, and how what that work is trying to do is reaching out. But I think it's important to have reviewers. We do, as publishers, we do rely on them.
Thank you, Professor. Rahulji, do you want to add a comment? Could you unmute yourself?
Yeah, my question was, because as I mentioned to you that besides Ashoka University, because there is a huge body of literature that I want to get translated. My issue is many times the translators make an effort, but to judge it, whether it is a good translation or not, how does, because you see, let's say I have 5 people or 7 people translating different stories. I have to find out if it's not a good story. I do not want to give the same translator a second story because it's not right. So I wanted you just little help, and I sent to some people who are close to me or who are Susham's friends and ask them, what do you think? And some translators, some are very good, and I've had comments like, this is the worst translation I've ever seen, So it stops me from going further, because I am myself not so familiar with the whole process to be able to judge how good a translation. I can make out whether English is, whether it makes sense in English or it is not. But my question was judging the quality, because when you go to a publisher, you want to go with the best translation, not with the mediocre or below mediocre translation. So how does one decide? How do I select, or when I identify translators, how do I select who are worth giving the project or not? So any advice you can give me will be really helpful.
Do you want to do this Rita, Sanchit, I'm asking you this. Neeta, do you want to do this here, or should we talk about this separately with Rahulji?
Yeah, we can do separately.
I think this is a very good idea. We can probably do a session, a Zoom call, because this is a long and important as well as very important thing. Was I think translations, really high quality translation, determines everything else. I mean, the whole publishing and everything that comes after the awards system. Everything depends on that, just that a good quality, a really high quality translation. So we can talk about this.
Yeah, and maybe we could do it, Rahulji, if you have one or two translations of stories, we can look at them together and maybe just have a talk about that.
Okay, Professor Pritchett.
Well, I'm just so delighted with today's presentation, and I'm so happy that Rahul and Susham's family and Susham's friends and colleagues have come together to achieve this. And I myself had the pleasure and honor of teaching with Susham for many years at Columbia. And also I have done a lot of translation. And so all these issues of use of metaphor, of Englishing, which is a wonderful phrase, to a wonderful description for a process that may be desirable and it may also be dubious. And I have come up finally with one thing that I think translators should owe to their audience, and one criterion that I think is universal. And I think that what translators owe to their readers is truth in labeling. In other words, if I've known translators who want to take great liberties in their translation and omit things or even add things in and change the wording, change the structure, there's really wild changes that some translators want to make for some texts. And I think that because there's so many translators and so many kinds of audience and so many kinds of text, that the one thing that translators really must do is tell the reader what they've done. And so this means a sort of introduction of some kind in which you simply say, I have omitted parts of the text that I thought were boring or repetitive, or whatever you've done. And as a scholar, I would also like to say that in that introduction, it would be most wonderful if you would give information about the textual history of where you got the text you are translating, because all too often in Hindi and Urdu publications that one looks for with considerations of translation, that you expect to find that the author has, or the editor has given you this information, but you find then that you don't get the information. And it's really valuable in the case of almost every text to know where it was first published, what kinds of variants there are, any controversies about it, any difficulties about it. And this may seem academic in some sense to some people, but remember that we're aspiring to have these translations be widely usable and become canonical in their own way. And so they deserve the level of scholarly attention and precision and truth in labeling that the most canonical texts now receive. So this is just a rant, and I just want to say that I hope this can lodge in the DNA of the project and of translators' minds somewhere. No matter what methods they adopt and what text they choose, I would think that truth in labeling is a sort of gold standard that I hope we'll all adopt. Thank you.
Dr. Pritchett, thank you so much. Lovely to hear you speak on this. And thank you for saying that, because what you're really talking about, I find it so interesting when a translator really puts in a note about all the things that you're saying, because otherwise it's as if you have to suspend disbelief and think that the text has just produced itself, and arrived before you. So it's so wonderful to hear you say that. And it's great that answers Rahul's question also a bit. Thank you.
speaking of Sushamji's work and questions of Englishing, there's a question regarding that. Would you agree that Sushamji's work speaks to an intersection of systemic misogyny and a kind of Anglophone hegemony that in many ways governs the global market for translated literatures?
Sanchit, who is that question to?
To you, Professor. You're on mute. Should I read it again?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. So it starts with a comment. Thank you for the beautiful talk. This is truly a wonderful initiative. I really think that to Sushamji's work, especially, so they're thinking about this question, especially in the context of Sushamji's work. And would you agree that it speaks to an intersection of systemic misogyny and a kind of Anglophone hegemony that in many ways governs the global market for translated literatures?
So I don't know Sushamji's work well enough to comment on that, but I would say that I would say yes to your other comment about an Anglophone domination and systematic misogyny, except that I think the misogyny is so deep-rooted that it is normalized and it is not seen as anything other than just normal behavior. But I don't know her work well enough to comment on that.
Thanks, Professor. I'll actually be just perhaps reading 2 more questions from the chat. This is another question. One of the texts that comes to my mind regarding women translating women is Spivak's translation of Devi's Draupadi in the foreword of the story. Spivak draws our attention to the process of translation itself. And if you could kindly point out how one could translate a woman's text without falling into the trap of colonialist theory of most efficient information retrieval about third world women.
I don't know if I can answer that question because I don't think there's an easy formula. I think what's very interesting actually when Spivak first translated Mahashweta Devi's work, I think one of the first stories she translated was the Bangla story called in Bengali Stonodaini, which Spivak translated as the breast giver, which was translated before Spivak did it by a translator called Ella Datta as the wet nurse. And Mahashweta herself at that time, or so I'm told, although I think I also spoke to her about it, felt that Gayatri Spivak's translation of, I think that particular story, I'm not sure, was something she did not immediately relate to. But over the years, I think she came to love it. And she came to see it as truly reflecting what she wanted to say in the story. So that is just, but she also continued to love the other translation, Ella Datta's translation. Understanding as a writer that there are different ways in which your work speaks to different people, and there are different ways in which they might render that work in another language. It's an interesting story about this. How can one not fall into the trap of colonialist theory of most efficient information retrieval? I cannot say except to say that I think it's not only about colonialist theory, it's about how to not fall into the question that was asked earlier, the misogynist trap, the male dominance trap, the sexist trap, all of those things. I think you just have to be extremely self-questioning and vigilant as a translator and have a humility to the text, towards the text you're approaching, in order to be able to look at that. But I can't offer any other formula. I am not an experienced translator. I've translated one book, and I am now kind of lusting after translating 2 more, but I don't know if I'll ever get there because I'm a publisher, not a translator really. So I don't know how to answer that question. Rita, who is a much more experienced translator, might be able to respond to that than I can.
I mean, very briefly, I think the answer lies somewhere between what Professor Pritchett was saying earlier and the question that has come to us, which is that you do need to contextualize a translation. You do need to provide some kind of an introduction which gives a sense of the journey that the author made, the journey that the translator made. What is the academic context, not just academic context, but what is actually the certain kind of a socio-political context which produces that work, and what has been the history of that work and its reception. But it also needs to be, I think, sort of not go to a place where it, in some sense, becomes an entirely an idiom, a language that only speaks to the academic community. And I think something like that does happen to Spivak's work. And I'm not sure that that's the way we want to go all the time. But I'm also quite clear that what Professor Pritchett was saying earlier, that translations do need to be contextualized and introductions do need to be given, histories of the book do need to be provided. And I think it is that balancing that needs to be done.
Thank you, Professor. The last question, actually, I'm just going to take two questions together, and if either of you, would wish to answer them. One is about culture, and the other one is about tradition. Do you have any advice on considering culture in translation? Do we need to shape certain aspects when we are trying to translate perhaps a medieval Indian text into modern English directed towards a modern Western audience? Then the other question, which could be brought together, is in the case of anthologies compiled with the aim of representing a particular tradition, how does a translator do justice to the said tradition, or what process does one undertake while choosing the stories they do to bring to light multiple aspects of the same?
I'll take both questions, Urvashi, since I think first of all, there are no blanket rules. As some of the translators in this room will tell you, there is no designated culture which is outside language. There is no designated tradition which is outside language. Really speaking, the moment you are dealing with language, as Susham Bedi herself mentions at the introductory slide that Sanchit showed, that you enter into something through language. So there's no question of, okay, now that I've dealt with a sentence, let me deal with culture. I mean, you will be dealing with it anyway, but how best you need to do it, these are also contextual decisions. And this is not, there are no golden rules about this. I mean, I think we will at some point try and do a workshop, but it is not to say that our workshop will be a manual, right? It's not going to be some kind of a corporate management workshop that can give you this set of rules to say, this is how you translate. These are decisions that translators very often take contextually. Similarly with anthology, there are anthologies that play a very representative role, that provide to you the canon of what goes on in a certain linguistic tradition. For instance, I've done anthologies which take on a large number of women writers from Gujarat, which Urvashi has published in a book called Speech and Silence. But I recently did another anthology, which is not representative, where the writers speak to each other and in some sense even confront each other over the idea of Gujarat, which becomes in some sense a point of contestation in that anthology. So even these are decisions that I think it's not for any one person to kind of lay down the law here. These are judgments that you will have to make on your own.
Yeah, Rita, if I could just add to that a little bit in relation to this last point that you made. Just an example from our own work. So we publish a lot on the northeast of India, and we decided to do a series of books, one from each state, looking at women's writing in each state. Now, in a sense, you might question many things about this assumption that there is a way in which writing of a certain kind can be contained within the administrative borders of a particular state. That's where your question of culture also comes in. And the editors of each of these anthologies, each one has chosen to, if you like, represent or think about how to work within that border called a state and how to subvert it also. So is it people who belong to, let's say if it's Nagaland, is it people who are Naga by birth, who belong to Nagaland, who live in Nagaland? Is it Nagas who are living outside, or is it people who have never lived in Nagaland? Is it people who have an affinity to Nagaland? How, what, where? All these are choices that the editor makes and has made. And when you enter that work, just as Dr. Pritchett was saying and Rita was saying, the introduction to that work locates you and presents you with all these choices. And then you can move beyond that to try and understand what is being done in that anthology.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, professors. That brings us to the end of Q&A. And Professor Kothari, over to you again to continue the conversation that we started.
Yeah, I mean, Urvashi gave some amazing stories. I'm only going to give you one small story, which is about women translating women and this particular project. So once we began this project, and we began with great excitement, I had this question to myself that, what do I want to work on? I usually translate from Gujarati and Sindhi, but Gujarati more sort of a. So I recently made a trip to Kutch, and I'm on the trail of a writer called Guli Sadarangani, who wrote a novel in the early 1940s. And I was trying to find out whatever I could about this writer. Just to give you an example of how this project has actually turned into, larger questions about women's history. Questions about what did women do with different historical junctures in different languages. And in some sense, it is also a question of what it is to be a woman, what it is to listen to another woman. And as one of the questions that came from the audience, what it is to get into the crevices and the small nooks and crannies when women are not saying much. How do you listen to that? And all these questions came to me as a part of this project. When I was trying to find out about Guli Sadarangani, I realized there is not a single wiki entry on the woman. And the only entry that I found from a newspaper published in 1956, of the 8 sentences that are written about her, 4 sentences are about her brother Krishna Kriplani, who was clearly a more well-known figure. And I said this to somebody, a very senior person whom I met in Kutch, and I said, well, why are they telling us about Krishna Kriplani? This entry is meant to be about Guli Sadarangani. And he said to me, but she didn't do that much. And you can quite imagine that this woman who wrote several novels, she's the first woman writer in Sindhi language. And even today, it's being said that she didn't do that much. So I think what we are therefore left with are projects of recovery, of discovery, of excavation that the Women Translating Women project will enable us to do. And for this, I want to express our gratitude to the Bedi family and to Susham Bedi, who stood on her own ground, who contributed to Hindi literature, who, threw some tough questions at even Salman Rushdie. And I feel that in some sense, that spirit imbues this project as we begin. And I'm so grateful that actually Urvashi started, this project for us through this inaugural talk, because she has, put in place many of the very tough questions that we are going to be dealing with as we go forward. Which women, what kind of women, what it is to listen to women, what it is to publish women, because in some sense, there is at the heart of this literary, political, ethical, economic questions involved, questions about representation and questions also about literary and social justice. I'm very, very grateful to Sanchit and Neeta for putting together such a great show. And as for the audience that on a Sunday evening has turned up to listen to this program and has supported us, I really have no words to thank you. Please write to us and please let us know any ideas that come to your mind. We will try our best to respond to them. We have certain plans of going ahead with the project. I will leave it to my team if they want to talk about it today or some other time. But I think at the moment, I just wanted to kind of give a shout out to all of you for being so generous about so many things to us at the Ashoka Center for Translation. It's unbelievable. We started this center only 6 months ago. And I think we've received just so much warmth and so much support that there are it looks great ahead. And we are very, very pleased. I'm saying this particularly on behalf of me and Arunva Sinha here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kothari, and thank you so much, everyone. Neeta and I are here if you need to ask us any logistical questions. But with that, it's a good evening to everyone in India, perhaps a good day to everyone joining us from the US. And as my colleague Aditya has already posted the link to our website, as well as our email ID and a newsletter link where you can just drop your email to receive updates regarding this as well as other projects of ours. So thank you so much once again for joining us this evening. And we all are grateful to you, to the Bedi family, to Professor Butalia, and to the being of language in general that's making all these things possible. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Sanchit, and thank you, Rita, and the whole team. I just want to say that there have been so many wonderful ideas that have come through in the chat, and I'm sure we'll, over the next few weeks and days, we'll sort of work out something and incorporate some of those wonderful suggestions. So thank you all for spending this evening with us, and thank you, Urvashi, for that wonderful, talk, and for really putting that in the perfect pitch to start this whole project.